Today we are reviewing Black Leopard Red Wolf, a book that will no doubt go down with as one of the most amazing and greatest fantasy books written in recent memory. Bold claim. We'll talk about the world, the plot, the violence, which I don't think people really understand just quite yet. And I think that it's worthwhile having a probing discussion on like why the violence is there and sort of like the nature of that violence and really what purpose the violence in this book serves, because it is foregrounded in a. Okay, so the world. Finally, we are able to escape the familiar horizon of medievalism that is so familiar to most fantasy readers. The world of Black Leopard Red Wolf is a really like welcome departure, as James sort of like he truly exports us to a land that's very unfamiliar, and a land that is suffused with African lore and mythology. We spend time traveling through sort of like flatlands and open savannas, rather than through sort of like wandering across like verdant hills or sort of like mist-clad mountains and spelunking through dwarven mines. There is a dark forest, which, you know, I guess you can never really get out of the fantasy forest. Like, there's always going to be a fantasy forest, and there's always going to be a city in the trees. But there are some really cool places. I love the fantasy genre because of sort of all the different lands that you get to visit. Sort of like an imaginative tourism, right? Like you get to go to all these unique lands that have really kind of sprung from someone's head. Now, some of the really cool places I thought in Black Leopard Red Wolf were the Hills of Enchantment, this place called the Purple Tower. They have a whole city of like philosophers and people sort of like dedicated to like studying, you know, like the riddles of life. There's a place called Me Too, which I thought was awesome. We don't really spend too much time there, but it is mentioned, and it's kind of like mentioned in like a very cool and intriguing way. There's also a place called Melangica, and this isn't a spoiler, and it's just like, it's sort of billed as a city of tunnels, and it's got like a hidden witches market. So it's like a more edgy Diagon Alley. There's of course your obligatory Great Hall of Records, which we do get to spend some time in, which is pretty cool. There's also Miss Wadada's House of Pleasurable Good and Services, which I thought was just like, I just love that name. It's obviously a brothel. We get like a pretty cool trip to a brothel as far as brothels are concerned. One of my favorite things as far as like places go is actually just like this random alley, and it's called like Alley of the Perfume Merchants, and it's just like that kind of sentiment and that kind of stylistic touch is evident really throughout the entire narrative. So you get all sorts of great moments of lyricism, even really being displayed all the way down to like a common street level, which is really cool. Okay, so the plot. This isn't really a plot-driven experience, but one where language and inference and character are what really give the story motion. Even then, I wouldn't say it's a forward motion in the sense of a, you know, clear start and finish, or even beginning, middle, end.
What?
Where you're kind of propelled through these phases of a story. This is way more elliptical and generally opaque, and, you know, it kind of begs the question, and it really kind of like puts the question to, I think, you know, people who are commonly expecting a clear start and finish, or a clear, clean run through an entire narrative experience. And so he does that in like just a wonderful way. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you know, we all definitely love a classic, compelling storyline. Like, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think one of the cool things James is doing here is sort of like subverting expectations a little bit, probably of the genre.
I got it!
That said, there is like a clear starting point with this fellow named Tracker, who is sort of like a finder of lost things, whether they be dogs or unfaithful wives or husbands. And so Tracker is eventually hired along with with this group of unsavory knaves, basically. And they're sort of like recruited to find, they're recruited to find this lost child. So you have this highly dysfunctional and disagreeable band of people who from the get-go are not really on each other's side.
Oh yeah, sounds
Recruited to find.
good.
Okay, now let's talk about like one of my favorite parts and one of the things that have been, really kind of celebrated all throughout the coverage of this book, which is the writing. And for me, the writing is like this very unique experiment. I don't think he nails it, but he does do something that I think a lot of authors, like starting with modernism, probably have really been trying to capture, which is sort of I think this immediate nowness or like this immediate present, and really what it's like to be immersed singularly in the present.
Cool.
So in the story and in the writing in particular, everything is very fluid and in flux, and it's sort of like this wonderful rush of water, or loose African winds, or loose winds like blowing across a wide savanna, where it blows hard, but then whispers, and no matter what is happening, it's always just rushing away and can never quite be captured. So everything is sort of fleeting and very momentary and very of the moment. And there's this wonderful, there's a great moment in the book where Tracker is speaking with the Inquisitor, who of course is sort of like recording this narrative on behalf of Tracker. He's trying to really kind of extract it from Tracker. And Tracker says, you're a collector of words. And he says, you have all these verses for different moments of life. But nature, which really precedes words, has no need for them. And more specifically, he alludes to, like a setting sun or a running cheetah. Both of those are primal. Both of those are fleeting. Both are in motion. Both are beyond the grasp of humankind, and beyond the grasp of signs created by humankind. So this sort of spirit really just kind of, it suffuses the book as a whole. So it allows for this wild and refreshing departure from, basically any book I think that's ever been written, and certainly any book that I've ever read. And again, it fills Black Leopard Red Wolf with this exotic and altogether new sort of lyricism. We are so encumbered with thoughts and history and modernity that this type of style is almost like a secret way, I don't want to say back, but maybe it is going back, like a secret way back to as close as we could ever hope to get to like origins, and it was like to just not be simple, but to be sort of like primal and primordially just kind of like in nature, primordially sort of like in experience, primordially in life. Long before we got to, again, all the research, all the history, all like the knowledge of millennia that's built up and turned into this sort of like thing that we call civilization. So again, like it's a really interesting departure from the way that we are, the way that we exist in modernity now, to what it might have been like back really at the dawn of humankind, and again, just a very unique being towards the world, and a very unique being in the world, and it's all created by this wonderful departure of style. Now, I'm not saying he does it like perfectly, but it's certainly a wonderful thing to experience, and the fact that it's in a fantasy genre is even like, I mean, it's even all the better, right? Like, I don't know that it could get any better. Okay, let's talk about the violence. Let's talk about the violence, really, of books and of bodies. So there are multiple kinds of violence in Black Leopard Red Wolf. I think the ones that bear most comment for me are the violence of books and the violence of bodies, or the violence of books and bodies. So there are bodies that are constantly undergoing some sort of violence, and we'll talk about those, potentially even touch on them in a moment. Okay, so let's talk about the violence of books, which kind of is also a violence of the body. If you look at the history of the book, of writing, of civilization, and all those things are kind of sewn up with one another, and they can even be supplementary and supplements of one another. Well, the history of these things is really also the history of violence, and they have a very violent history. And Tracker knows this. Tracker knows how things are said or how things are spoken might be recorded or written differently depending on the needs of the subjectivity or perspective that is recording them. And that's a kind of violence. That's a very serious kind of violence when something comes out of one subjectivity's mouth and then is sort of like transferred, translated, reinterpreted by another subjectivity, especially when it's changing medium, right? We have them going from the medium of speech to the medium of writing. And you could even say that there's a major violence between the speech, the transfer of speech to the transfer of writing. And so bound up with this kind of violence is the violence of the sign, of forcing the sign to be equivalent to the signified. That is, for a series of written letters and written words to sort of map perfectly to meaning. And as Nietzsche pointed out, in the mid 1800s, what really accomplishes this is nothing other than power. So some things we naturally suppress, right? And this is the violence of memory. Some things we just don't want to talk about. Some things we don't want to talk about with ourselves or with others. Some things we will say differently on purpose when we're talking to ourselves, or some things we'll say differently or on purpose when talking with others. And oftentimes, depending on the event and the subjectivity, we will do this unconsciously. So there's a conscious violence of memory that represses things and reinterprets things, sort of like at command of our will. And then there's also, the deeper violence of the subconscious that we can't control, that reinterprets and suppresses and forcefully forgets things. And Tracker knows this as well. And one of the great things about this book is if you're paying attention, there are very explicit moments where Tracker engages in this kind of suppression, this violence of his own memories. And this willful suppression on Tracker's part is a great conceit in terms of like a more nuanced form of violence. There's really kind of discovered, I would say, with Nietzsche, and really kind of elaborated on more in postmodernism. But both James and Tracker, I think, are aware of it, and it's something that both James and Tracker very interestingly play with throughout the novel, which again makes it like this wonderful and very worthwhile read. Okay, so now to the violence of bodies. Okay, yeah, the violence of fleshy bodies, though they're technically still bound in a book, and so they're on leafy pages, which I think is of note. So in a sense, all of these characters and all of these thoughts and all of these ideas are bound and enslaved within the confines of the book, which is a leafy prison, which is kind of a forest prison. And if you've read the book, that might have certain special meaning to you. And they're only free really to play under the reader's sort of like devouring gaze. There's a violence here that we've sort of all but forgotten in the West. And I think James is really trying to sort of like re-foreground this violence in a way, really kind of the way that Tad Williams does in his Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn series, and especially like the opening of the Dragon Bone Chair. James is saying hey, I know you've come to this book with a certain expectation of violence in fantasy. Like, as a fantasy reader, you expect there to be violence. As part of the reading experience of the fantasy genre, you expect violence. As a modern reader, you might even unknowingly or knowingly sort of relish, valorize, or romanticize violence. And so James is likely saying to us readers, well, one way I'm going to sort of subvert your expectations of the genre and of violence in particular is to give you so much violence that it really disturbs you. Is that I'm going to overdo the violence. I'm going to give you so much violence. There will be so much violence and slaughter and violation that you might remember why looking for these things is very, very dangerous. And these are very, very dangerous in the first place. After all, now that this story has reminded you of how violent the real world is, the violent heritage that we all kind of come from, is that something that you should really be looking for in your stories? And lastly, he might even be prodding us and asking us, well, now that you've read these horrific acts and you're reminded of the brutality of the external world and the brutality of the past that we've all come from, what are you going to do about it, right? We could be really moving here from sort of an exploration of an idea to pushing us to take some action, right? We're basically moving like in the classic realm from metaphysics to physics to ethics. And there, if you're paying attention again, in the book, there's a major moment where that question is basically asked and it's answered. There's of course an easy answer for all this violence, right? It's just, this is a fairly dark book of the fantastical, and therefore you need lots of horrific, gruesome acts to really just, create the atmosphere. And don't ever forget, remind people just how dark and cold the world is. If you're looking for a really dark and cold book, it's definitely this one. There's no meaning, there's no point to anything. And there's violence simply because, it's a dark and cruel world. As Tracker, and there's evidence for this, right? There's evidence for this as well. Tracker himself says, he loves no one and believes in nothing. He doesn't even believe in belief. However, I'd still say, a scrupulous reading does suggest, or at least gesture towards, I think some of my initial thoughts that Tracker is a good place to watch James subtly reveal why there is the level of violence and the kinds of violence within this book. All right, and with that, I'll leave you to explore the wild and exciting world that Marlon James has created in Black Leopard Red Wolf. Again, highly, highly recommend it. It's going to be a trilogy, so there's going to be some different perspectives that we learn about over the course of this work. But it's off to a phenomenal start. Again, like nothing I've ever read, really in poetry, philosophy, and certainly within the fantasy genre itself. I'm super excited to see what comes next. And if I can actually do some spelunking and potentially find something comparable. But I do think, this is just a wonderful book. It's definitely going to push you and challenge you to think differently. And you're definitely going to experience some things that'll make you feel a bunch of different ways and potentially very conflicted. Which means that the work of art to challenge your horizons, to make you feel uncomfortable, to get you to start questioning things, is doing exactly what it's supposed to do.